Good evening, queens and kings of Queens. My name is Shakira Smalls, and I am the Executive Director for the Langston Hughes Community Library and Culture Center. And I am honored and privileged to welcome you to the pre-Juneteenth Virtual Series powered by Assemblywoman Alicia Hindman, Queens Public Library, and Elmcore Youth and Adult Activities. Being a part of one of the biggest and most diverse boroughs in the world, we understand the power in community, collaboration, and the need for a strong foundation. This excites us to bring to you a series of edutainment on the multi-layers and importance of Juneteenth. As you may be aware, Juneteenth is not the day the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law, yet the day the last of our Black ancestors were freed from the shackles of enslavement and perpetuity. While we embark together on this virtual journey from Monday through Friday in preparation of our in person celebration at Roy Wilkins Park on Juneteenth, I ask that we listen with the intent to learn and appreciate the good, the bad, and the uncomfortable truths of this nation. I like to leave you with the words of Frederick Douglass. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Until next time, yours in power.
Thank you, Shakira. Appreciate that welcome. And welcome to all of our audience from far and near who have joined us this evening for this panel entitled History of Juneteenth, a lesson not taught in schools. And we have a prestigious panel of activists who have joined us today, and we'll be discussing the issues of Juneteenth and the history of Juneteenth. I'm going to ask that the screen share be put up as I introduce my panel, so the background will be information for our community. My name is Andrew Jackson, also known as Sekou Molefi Bako. I'm a professor of Black Studies at York College of the City University of New York, and I'm going to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. And it happens that the first panelist is the esteemed Honorable Hazel Dukes, who is a civil and human rights activist, the past national president of the NAACP, and if I'm not mistaken, is the current president of the New York State NAACP, and has been worked on President Lyndon Johnson's 1960s Head Start program, and I love that because my father was a director of the Head Start program here in Corona, East Elmhurst, and also a community organizer for Nassau County's Economic Opportunity Commission. So please welcome the Honorable Hazel Dukes. Second, Dr. Robert Fullerlove, brother that I just met this evening, is a public health researcher, a civil rights activist. He is a professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia University's Irving Medical Center and an associate dean of community and minority affairs at Columbia University. Welcome, Dr. Fullerlove. And last but definitely not least, our own Honorable Alicia Hindman, the member of the New York State Assembly representing the 29th Assembly District in South Queens, New York since 2015. She's a former member of Community Board 12 and 13 in Queens, served on the Board of Education committees, and as a New York State Assembly member, she is the prime sponsor of this legislation making Juneteenth a state holiday here in New York, and is chair of our Juneteenth 2021 festival. So welcome, Assemblywoman Hindman, and this is our panel. As an educator, I wanted to make sure our audience has some background information on Juneteenth. Juneteenth, which means June 19th, going back to 1865 in Galveston, Texas, also known as Freedom Day, Emancipation Day, Jubilee Day, and Liberation Day. It is the oldest known oldest known celebration honoring the end of slavery in the United States, and was originally celebrated in Texas on June 19, 1866, to mark the first anniversary of the day that African Americans there first learned of the Emancipation Proclamation more than 2 years after it was initially issued by President Lincoln. The Civil War ended in 1865, and in Texas, the enslaved did not receive the news of freedom as outlined in the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation until that day, June 19th, 1865. There's some arguments as whether they did or not know that or not. I'm seeing some research on that now. But even if they did know that the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, they still were not notified that they were free in Texas. So Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime executive order meant to give freedom to the enslaved in Southern Confederate states in rebellion with the Union. And the executive order did not apply to slaves in northern states that held slaves or border states. And those were the 5 southern states that did not secede but remained loyal to the Union and President Lincoln during Civil War. The proclamation itself read in part, all persons held as slaves held within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. And this was also considered a humanitarian document. It happened during the period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, where General Gordon Granger and his federal troops traveled to the Southeast to assess the aftermath of the war. On the balcony of the Ashton Villa in Galveston, Texas, his General Order number 3 that read, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free." And the order continues going into information about the absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between the former masters and their slaves. And languages about equality included the words of the American Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, signaling freedom for 250,000 people in Texas. And that is why we purposely look at Juneteenth as a celebration of the final people who have learned that they are free following the Civil War and, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation. So I leave you with these thoughts. Juneteenth provides an annual opportunity to think back to a time when millions of people in America were not free, and to remember the sacrifices made by those who fought and died to make their freedom a reality. Every June 19th, we are reminded of the challenges faced by slaves freed from bondage into a new way of life, freedom, with its own unforeseen and unforeseeable difficulties and opportunities. Of this historical point in time when slaves could first make the supremely important claim that they were finally and irrevocably free at last. Juneteenth is celebrated every year precisely because it does involve a subject that is of real importance. Indeed, there can be no subject worthy of celebration and study than human freedom. And I leave you with this quote by Dr. George Wright, from the president of Prairie View A&M University: "The whole Black struggle to gain equality is important, not only for Blacks to know, but for all people to know." So that ends the background information on Juneteenth, and we'll ask that the screen share be closed out and that the faces of our esteemed panel be brought on, and welcome each of you to this week of critical panels and discussions on different topics related to what we've put together this year as our Juneteenth in Queens, the 2021, and hope that each of you will take time this week not only to enjoy the outdoor festival this Saturday, but sit down and enjoy the panels and the information and the topics of importance that this committee has put together. And it has been an esteemed honor working with our Assemblywoman and also with this panel of activists around the borough to put together Juneteenth in Queens 2021. So, good evening, panel. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good to have you take off your moots and let's get to have a discussion. We're going to have time for the audience to ask questions as well. So my first question is, when did you, and each of you can answer this question, when did you hear of Juneteenth for the first time and learn about it? And what was your reaction when you did hear about this thing called Juneteenth?
Well, let me say, I first heard it from a relative, a cousin of mine who were older than I was. I had never heard about it in school, not through uh, segregation in school, in college years, no. And so my cousin, who came from Montgomery, Alabama, and she said, do you all have Juneteenth here? The Juneteenth. Yeah, the 19th of June, it's on the calendar. What are you talking about? And so therefore, your opening statements, as I was listening very carefully, just remind me how much on this program that, and let me first say, express my gratitude to the Assemblywoman and her staff for inviting me, and to the Queen's Library and Alcon for doing this. As we review our past, education is so important, not just for us as African American, but as you said, for the world to know. Everyone else have their history known. They read about it, they are taught. And here we are, even in 2021, most of our young people, if you say what this is about, they don't know, unless we having the cookout and the party in the parks. That's the only way we're going to get it to them. But I want to thank our Assemblywoman, who I have watched since her election, being very strategic and remembering what we need to do, and especially in education, where my heart lies. This must be, it must be a national holiday, and it must be a curriculum in our teaching of in our children, from pre-K through master's, PhD, or whatever. This cannot be lost again. And when we talk about the enslavement, we're still enslaved. Because people don't know about June 19th. So we are not free. Systematic racism.
Yeah, I agree. Brother Fullerlow.
Yes, sir. When did I first hear about it? In June 1964, Holly Springs, Mississippi, in Marshall County, part of the Freedom School that we were putting there. I was in my first year as a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the late Ralph Featherstone, who was the architect of the Freedom Schools that were part of Mississippi Freedom Summer, was very invested in talking to young people, and it turned out to be old folk as well in that state, many of whom had never gone beyond the 3rd grade, to help them understand why we were in Mississippi to get people to register to vote. Isn't it interesting that Juneteenth is happening at a time when we are in the midst of electoral season? So the idea that I first heard about it as something that we would teach in the Freedom Schools, where we were trying to get people to understand that there was a direct link between our emancipation at that particular moment in history and everything that we were trying to do with the vote. It was to literally make that connection. So we had young people back then, and remember, it wasn't a well-known holiday. This was one of those interesting little-known facts in history that was meant to sort of spruce up the curriculum so that folk would be engaged with the idea that there's something really important about history, and that the drive to get Black people to register to vote in that state was really connected to that. Now, for those folk who don't recall Mississippi Freedom Summer, this is after 3 young men, the very first day of Mississippi Freedom Summer, had disappeared. We knew that they were dead. Their bodies were ultimately discovered August 4th, 1964. They even made a terrible movie about it called Mississippi Burning. But the key was this had urgency, because when you were asking people to register to vote in Mississippi in 1964, they knew you were asking them to risk their lives. Right. Connect the events of a bloody civil war, the bloodiest conflagration that this nation has ever known. More people died in the Civil War than died in all the wars that this country fought in the 20th century. So the whole notion that you wanted to tie this up and you wanted to motivate people to think I am a citizen of this country. My rights as a citizen include that I should be able to register to vote, and connecting this to emancipation was critically important. And I really want to underscore a point that Adam Dukes made. The Southern Poverty Law Center in 2018 did a survey of American high school seniors, asking them what was the cause of the Civil War. Only 8% of high school seniors could identify slavery as the cause of that conflagration. So the idea that today we are still struggling to learn the lessons of history at a time when everything that we're trying to do to reinvigorate the interest in the vote, the notion that we are members of this country, that maybe a conversation about reparations is long overdue. The idea that all this is tied together means that at this point in 2021, Juneteenth has special significance because it's, once again, not an issue just of our past. It's about our present as well as our future.
All right, thank you, brother. And Assemblywoman Hyman, unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Sekou. I have to say that from where I started to now, it is such an honor to sit on this panel with all of you. And my first interaction with Juneteenth was at SUNY New Paltz because I took an introduction to Black Studies courses, being a Black student. Not an educational opportunity student, but my parents had remortgaged their house coming here as immigrants. They said, we want you to go away to school. I was happy to go to Brooklyn College. They said SUNY New Paltz, and they knew something I didn't know. But in those Black Studies courses in the early 90s is where I learned about Juneteenth. Never heard a word about it. I came to this country, I was in the sixth grade through 12th grade, never heard anything about Juneteenth. And I loved history. I could talk about history. I could tell you everything about the American Revolution, the Indian and French War. I could talk about the Louisiana Purchase, but I did not know anything about Juneteenth, about Black history until I went to SUNY New Paltz. And the Black Studies department is still there. And I took so many classes, every elected class, every choice I made, I took a Black Studies class. I needed dance credit, I took Black dance. I needed music credit, I took Black music. And I had so many credits. By the time I reached, I think, the spring of my junior year, the chair of the department, God bless her, she's passed, Dr. Margaret Wade Lewis said, Ms. Hyman, do you realize if you take one more class, you could be a double major, Black Studies and Communications Media? I said, absolutely, sign me up. So I ended up as a double major from SUNY New Paltz with Black Studies and Communications Media. And all of my education, I believe, has brought me to this point where I wear this assembly pin because when the assembly was erected in New York State, it had no idea it would see the likes of me being in the New York State Assembly, and I don't take that lightly.
That's special. That is seriously special. Thank you. I think I learned about Juneteenth. It had to be when after I started at Langston Hughes Library as Institute Director. Started there in 1980, went back to complete my undergraduate degree in 1983. And the first class I took was Introduction to Black Studies, actually the course that I teach at York College now. And I'm sure that Brother Allen, James Allen, who was the professor of that class, probably talked about Juneteenth as part of the Introduction to Black Studies. And then when I started doing research, I would look in the encyclopedias and the almanacs, especially the Afro-American Almanac, and different resources. And basically you could find basically one paragraph that just was a little narrative about Juneteenth. And the other topic that was brought up that I wanted to learn about, which is also celebrated this year, but not celebrated, but remembered this year, is the Tulsa 1921 massacre and all of the specials that have been on, documentaries that have been on TV about that. And when I would look that up, it was basically one small paragraph about Tulsa 1921. And the more I did research, especially being at Langston Hughes Library, where it has the largest circulating Black heritage collection of any public library in the state of New York, the more research I did, the more hungry I came for that knowledge, and I got to be in the same boat you are, sister, and where that became my passion. I majored in business, but my passion was Black studies, and being at Langston Hughes and working at York College, the more I learned, the more I shared, the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. So this history of Juneteenth, and coming from Brother Fuller Love's talking about Mississippi, my family is from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and migrated here with the Great Migration. They taught us things about what they knew about the South and why they moved north, etc. But Juneteenth wasn't one of those topics. So even then, it was still a fairly known secret. And I put things like Tulsa 1921 and the Underground Railroad is probably the two best known secrets in American history. And then Juneteenth is extended to that because as well known as it is in Texas and maybe California and maybe Arkansas and that lower southwest, most of the people don't know about Juneteenth because it hasn't been celebrated. But now in the 21st century, all of this is being uncovered and unearthed, just like Clotilda, the slave ship that was found this past weekend and documented for the family in Alabama. Our history is still being uncovered and unearthed and being shared. So as we're beginning this Juneteenth 2021 week of panels leading to the celebration, it's time to educate people and share this information. And I think being able to do this virtually allows us to reach so many more people than what we would meet if we were trying to meet in one location, because then Sister Dukes would have had to come in from Baltimore and Brother Fuller Love would have had to come down from where he was today. So this virtual gathering makes it much more easier for us to do what we're doing today, and it's important. So the second question, and I'll start this off with Brother Fuller Love, why is the importance of teaching the true history of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 as a wartime order and Juneteenth in 1865 as the final notification to that 250,000 enslaved in Texas current, so essential to teach today to our current generation, but especially to future generations? Why is this so important?
I think it has two elements. Number one, it's a way for us to recognize our response to the end of something that is in all of our DNA. But the second thing is that it now gives us an opportunity to do something as a professor that I long for, to get people to reacquaint themselves with history. The biggest thing about Juneteenth for me is that, forgive me, it didn't end slavery in the United States. Slavery is in 3 articles of the Constitution of the United States. In order for slavery then to end, having been established as part of what we would do to create this country, you needed to have the 13th Amendment. What's the ongoing significance of the 13th Amendment? It ended slavery, but set up mass incarceration. It reads, there shall be no slavery in the United States with one exception, if you've been duly convicted of a crime. The big question is, why did you just end slavery? Why did you have this back door? Why have the exception? Well, the answer, because this is the way the South maintained its power as an economic entity by not necessarily having slave labor, but having incarcerated labor. That we still live with the shadow of incarceration literally connects us to the evidence that I think we've been talking about today about the importance of Juneteenth, but it's also a way to remind us that the job isn't done. We are way overrepresented in the criminal justice system in the United States. It is literally a way in which we enforce second-class citizenship on anybody who's been convicted of a felony. You have a much harder time surviving in a community with a felony conviction than you did before. So the idea that this is a way of maintaining servitude, a way of maintaining social control. Every time we talk about the history of how we got to this moment, thinking about Juneteenth as the positive, this is what we did to celebrate our independence, reminds us that in the year 2021, we still have work to do.
Thank you. And thank you for, I love the way these questions and the discussion is leading into each other, because the 13th Amendment and 14th Amendment are definitely part of that discussion of Reconstruction. Sister Hyman? Well, Well, this is another connectedness to that question. For many, there is a strained relationship between Independence Day, July 4th, and the history of enslavement and freedom, Juneteenth. Juneteenth became a state holiday in Texas in 1980. In 1997, Congress declared the June 19th of June Independence Day. And then in 2020, as we said here in New York State, it was designated a state holiday. And there are other states, I think, that now have designated it as state holidays as well. And Sister Dukes already kind of answered this in herself, should this be made a national holiday?
Absolutely. Just listening to Dr. Fully Love's talk about the 13th Amendment, I think when children learn our history, there's certain dates we all have to remember, right? July 4th, 1776. And I remember, like, why would I celebrate that holiday? Because it didn't include me. If I was born then, I would be the master on the plantation, and whether I be in the big house or in the fields, they would be celebrating, and I'd still be catching it later on that day or that night, right? And especially the victimization of Black women. I think that for a long time, when it comes to July 4th, a lot of us don't celebrate. You may be with family, but you don't see a lot of American flags, and we're not all, we may barbecue, like Sister Duke said, and Black people, a lot of us do love a good barbecue. But when it comes to the significance of July 4th and what it means for our communities, meaning that we were still in bondage, it was not our Independence Day. It is their Independence Day, and still is their Independence Day. And I think that is something that we fundamentally have to teach our children about what is really our what is our Independence Day. And I take that to mean Juneteenth symbolically would be our Independence Day, not July 4th.
And it's just ironic that they fall within probably less than 30 days of each other. I had that same discussion, and I remember the first time I learned about Frederick Douglass's speech of what the 4th of July means to the Negro that he did in 1852. And once I read that, my whole connection to July 4th changed, and I would have discussions with my family, and I'd have discussions with students, and I have discussions at the library. But yeah, we have to recognize that, as W.B. Du Bois always talked about, that there are two warring souls within us as people. One is being Black in America, and the other is being an American. And many times, and I think we all know from our own life experiences, they clash. That being Black sometimes is contradicting the fact that you are an American, because as Malcolm said, if you're American, you wouldn't go through the hell you go through. So and even the discussion on what is freedom is leads to another discussion, as Brother Fuller said, and Sister Dukes. Educational ignorance and apartheid is a form of slavery, and that's what W.B. Du Bois talked about. It's what Carter G. Woodson talked about. I signed Miseducation of the Negro to my students so they can see what that means to be miseducated, and we all have been miseducated. So that leads to that discussion. Sister Dukes?
Absolutely. This is fantastic. So many things come to my mind about the celebration of the other holidays. And here we are been miseducated, misinformed about really what Juneteenth meant to us. And so I believe that it's our responsibility to make sure that there's not another generation lost in knowing the real history. The Assemblywoman, we were on a program earlier around 2 o'clock today with the legislators talking about their space now that they are in as elected officials, and what we as advocates, those outside of the policy making decision, should be pushing forward for those who make the policy to understand what their spaces now and what we should accomplish in this century. We shouldn't let another century go by where we said to ourselves, what do we want to measure by? What do we want to take from this Juneteenth to next year Juneteenth when we come back together? What can we say that we have? What programs, what policies have we put in place to make the correction? And that's why criminal justice was at the forefront this year, because as Professor said, yes, the enslavement of the high number of Black and brown in the incarcerated for the same thing. When you look at all the data, Black and brown, white, same, committed to same mischievous or behavior problems. You come to the parole system, we can't get out, but they can. That's why we had to talk about elder care. And so we are enslaved. More Black and brown people are incarcerated. Why? Why? And the answer have to go to education. It have to go to poverty. So all of these things is consistent, and therefore for our policymakers and for us who are advocates out here have to push harder. We cannot let up. We at a space now where we have people talking about it, but we don't want just talk. As Tamika Mara would say, we got to make people be accountable. Yes, we elected Biden and Harris, and Biden is saying the right things, but we got to make him be accountable. Just not the right things. We got to have policy. We have to have the John Lewis. We have to have HR 1. We got to get the parole system going. We don't need to go back because we didn't make the right hour that we were supposed to. We didn't have the employment. I know what you've done in Queens. I know what you've done at Elko. I know the kind of pressure. And now we have people who are not only talking, but they are walking the walk. I mean, every one of our African-American legislators was there on the criminal justice. When Hasty was first elected, he said if he didn't do anything else, he wanted to see the legislation on raise the age, because New York State was still doing our children as adults. And so we finally got that passed. We got 58 passed, but we got so much more to do to get us from being slaves.
Thank you. Thank you. True that. Talking about legislation, Sister Hyman, would you tell us something about the process that it took to get Juneteenth designated as a state holiday and where we still have to go? Because even though it's a state holiday, the date itself has not been set of when we're going to celebrate Juneteenth, so that businesses are closed on the same day. But can you tell us what that process was all about and how you went about it?
So I know her camera is off, but Tanisha Morrison, who is definitely our in-house liberationist of her upbringing, who's my chief of staff and a dynamic young woman after the death of George Floyd and the protesting and the marches. And in Queens, we had a huge protest on behalf of the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian caucus. We had a huge march in Queens, and Tanisha said, you should put in this legislation. And the legislation was entered. I got to give a shout out to Philip, he's the legislative director in Albany, and I have a great staff. I really have a great staff. We put the legislation in, and shortly after that, the governor of our state made an announcement about he's going to do Juneteenth in New York State. And I was like, wait a second, I put the bill in. How are you not going to acknowledge this Black woman putting in this legislation? And, after some fiery tweets, because, apparently I did call the staff. I did do the procedures. I called the staff and no one called me back until the tweets came up. And it was like, oh, Assemblymember Hyman, how can we work this out? The bottom line is the legislation was signed into law last year, making Juneteenth a statewide holiday. Now, what does that mean? It means that for us, we know the significance, but for most state public workers in the state of New York, because Juneteenth falls on the 19th, it's a specific day, they can use the day later on as a floater. In the city of New York, this is what I was talking to some of my girlfriends about who work for the city of New York, said that de Blasio was trying to play with the numbers and not give city employees the day off, because they should observe it either the Friday before or the Monday after. And it's a game being played about that right now. But it means that all city and state offices throughout 62 counties in New York State will have that day off. Now, for me, it's not just a day off. I saw some of the, I saw an assistant principal from District 29 on. It's about the historical significance that needs to be taught to our children on that day off. And I'll give you an example. My daughter, my youngest daughter, is in the fifth grade. Today, I was like, why are they playing? Why is your teacher? She's doing remote learning. They're playing Elvis Presley music. And I was like, what's going on? She said, yeah, why are we learning about Elvis Presley? He took all the Black people's songs. Now, I know what I'm teaching her, and she's able to critically, think critically and know that that is not accurate history. And her teacher is white. And I said, my daughter will say it, and I've heard her say it in remote learning about other things. But to me, it's the history that's not being taught in our public schools, where children look mostly like me. And so Juneteenth is to bring all of that full circle, that I now know that every department of education, whether it be a city or a county agency in the state of New York, has the power to change curriculum, has the power to change history, has the power to change who you celebrate every, not just February, but every month of the year in those 10 months that our children in public schools. Juneteenth to me is not just, it's a day of remembrance, but it just opens the floodgates on all the other history our children aren't learning. And that is, for me, the significance, and which is why, for District 29 and throughout the borough of Queens, this is so important for us to make sure that Juneteenth is a historical holiday that people will learn. And this will be a gateway for them to ask more and more questions about what else do we not know about our history.
Thank you, thank you. And as we close out the panel discussion and get ready to open up the doors for our audience to ask questions, it reminded me, I was channel checking earlier today to try to calm down, because I get excited about all this education that I'm doing and interact with panels like this. And I came across a movie with George Clooney. It was about during World War II, they were looking for artifacts that were stolen by the Germans during World War II. And George Clooney made this comment, and I said, this is so fitting for what we're doing this week. He said, why was it so important to unearth all of this art that these Jews had lost and had been stolen from them during the war? And he said, first, it acknowledges that they exist. And secondly, it acknowledges the contributions that they made, that if we don't do this work, nobody will ever know who they were or what they contributed. And I think that's what this week of panels is about, and the importance of Juneteenth as a statewide holiday, hopefully a national holiday. It acknowledges that we exist. It acknowledges the contributions that we made, not only when we were enslaved, but when we were allegedly free in this country.
And that's why, before you close out, that's why it was so important, brought back so many members about the teaching in Mississippi with the freedom schools. We did have some freedom schools in New York under Dr. Marriott, First Corinthian Church, the Links. We did have some freedom schools, and I think we have to go back to that. I think we need to do teaching on this day. We should gather our families, just not the children. We should gather parents, because they don't even know what it means. And I think one of the things that we should do as community is have teaching, not just serve the hot dogs and the sodas. That's fine. We can give that to them but the real nourishment should be our history.
And I would close that out with also that we cannot, as we have said, and I've heard it from you, Sister Dukes, and I've definitely heard it from professors and activists that I've known that have impacted my life. We cannot leave our education of our people up to the Board of Education.
Absolutely,
Some
absolutely.
Board of Miseducation, because they refuse to teach our history as part of the curriculum, but also to teach you the culture, the history of all cultures, and what we all have contributed to make America what it allegedly claims that it is today. Frederick Douglass's comment, knowledge makes a person unfit for slavery. This knowledge make people unfit for slavery, that they do know what Juneteenth is. They do know that there's a difference between Juneteenth and July 4th, the African American Day of Freedom and America's Day of Freedom. And they do know that there are methods and means to learn who we are, what we are, where we came from, and what we contributed. And that mean is education. So we'll leave it at that and ask that first, I understand Senator Leroy Comrie is with us. I'd like him to chime in and make some comments and welcome us and greet us as well. Brother Comrie? I hope he's still there.
I'm still here, but I was in the middle of doing something else. Let me just say hello. I want to thank Assemblymember Hyman. I want to thank the panel for putting this together. Assemblymember Hyman for making sure that this bill got passed on the Assembly side. I was proud to vote for it as a member of the State Senate. This is an important period in our lives where we have to show pride and show self-determination, because clearly the forces of evil are trying to create separation and create self-doubt in our people at every stage. And I think that Juneteenth is a great way to re-educate our people, to give them pride, to give them a sense of self, to give them a new opportunity to find a purpose and a determination to move ahead in this society. So I want to thank everyone for making this happen, for putting together all of the educational pieces around it. And I look forward to a great week of events and activities that will hopefully lead to a continued opportunity to educate and re-educate folks about their power, about their history, and about their purpose. So thank you, Assemblymember Hyman. Thank you to the moderator, Brother Jackson, and to all of the panelists as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Brother Comrie. I'm looking at some of the questions. One of the questions is, can you please talk a bit about the violent backlash in response to our freedom? I'll open that up to Brother Fuller and then Sister Dukes, and then our assembly person.
So let me say that the contemporary violent backlash has, at least for me, been very connected to the period 1619 to 2019, 400 years of slavery, and all of the scholarship that got produced in 2019 that really focused the nation's attention on all the issues that we've been describing. Everybody who understands and has talked about the failure to teach history was hoping that this would be a body of material that would make its way throughout public schools in the United States, that it wouldn't just be us who were educated, they would be educated as well, because I think that's obviously equally as important. But what has happened as a consequence? Well, the most significant of these has been the 1619 papers that were assembled by the New York Times. They are being used in a variety of different school districts, and the pushback has been violent. Why? Because the minute you acknowledge that this was a slave-holding democracy, a contradiction in terms, you have to then begin to talk about structural racism. Not racism as my feelings towards you, my attitudes towards you and your people, but things that go beyond how we treat and deal with each other, to look at everything about the structures that were put in place with those 3 articles of the Constitution that live with us today. Everybody has been very clear that if you start that conversation, students in the United States have to confront racism everywhere. They have to confront issues of privilege. Why is it that people have continued to benefit from all the evils that were a part of that 400-year period. Well, how many states are now saying that this is an assault against American patriotism? That as soon as we start to use words like racist to describe the United States, we're suddenly going to stop loving this country, whatever that means. And we're going to start to do things that are going to question the very foundation of everything that mainstream America, that's a nice way of putting it, that mainstream America believes. So the idea that we're now in a major battle, not just to teach each other, but to be very clear that if you will have a true vision of the history of this country, if you are to understand where it is now and what its future is going to be, you have to understand something about how much we have been configured by slavery. Question that I ask all my graduate students at Columbia that almost nobody knows. How many American presidents owned slaves? And if you're starting to guess, it's exactly the degree to which what I'm describing is so important, because the number was 12. Understand, Biden is the 46th president of the United States. That means that more than 1/4 of all the presidents up to Ulysses Grant were folk who held slaves, and not having that conversation in schools, I think, is a form of violence against us, against everything that we've had to do to survive in this country, and everything that I think captures the vision that we have for ourselves and for the future of our kids. So this battle, which I think is neatly carried by what Assemblywoman has done, is a way of saying, you know, you got to confront this. You can't ignore it. If you want to think about the direction this country is taking, understand this critical moment in its past, use Juneteenth as a way of sort of understanding that there is a way forward, and then we jump on that train and go there. So
that's, you know, that's very interesting, Assemblywoman, because Assemblywoman Stokes said today when we were looking at what we would like to see in 22 when we come back from this year, she said she would like to see that race come to the top of the agenda, that people would talk about racism, which nobody wants to do, even in their policy making decisions. And you so eloquent said it.
And I would add that the connection to that also would be that you have to look back at the 1857 Dred Scott decision in the Supreme Court of Missouri. Dred Scott, a slave, he and his wife were slaves that belonged to a military position. He travels and moves to a free state. Dred Scott feels he should be free. He petitions the court. Judge Taney, in his decisions in 1850, said he was not a citizen, so he couldn't bring the case to the court because slaves were designated in the Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution as 3/5 of a person and private property. Congress, the founding fathers, and this is from the Supreme Court decision, the founding fathers of the Constitution never intended for blacks, slave or free, to be citizens of the United States. And then the sentence to that struck me when I was reading this out of John Hope Franklin's book, From Slavery to Freedom: blacks, free or slave, have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And that has always been the answer to everything that has happened to us throughout history. Put in writing by a Supreme Court justice in Missouri, blacks, whether slave or free, have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And that leads to the clash of violence that we have seen throughout the centuries in this country. And we are, and because Brother Fuller has referred to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we have to remind people that may not be aware the 13th Amendment is citizenship, it ends the war. The 14th Amendment, citizenship rights except for those who have committed a crime. And the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. And I remember asking, well, if the 15th Amendment gives us the right to vote, then why do we need the Voting Rights Act in 1965? And then why do we need a Voting Rights Act today? Because it is still an act. It wasn't finalized. It wasn't forever. It was still piecemeal. And even today was
Today.
fighting in Washington, D.C. for John Lewis's law about the Voting Rights Act, and voter suppression is still an issue. So it seems like whenever Black people petition and struggle for their rights of freedom and equality in this country, there's a backlash, and that backlash is white
Absolutely.
supremacy and white violence.
Sekou, there's a question in the chat by Tunisia about the Great Migration, and I think one of the things that really makes being in the assembly is very interesting, and I'm going to tie this all in. In the assembly, it's very interesting when my colleagues talk about the Second Amendment all the time when it comes to gun laws and gun and violence. And, you know, maybe you just need to educate those Black kids about, you know, gun safety. And I'm listening to them, and they love to talk about the Second Amendment. And this is what, this ties me back to the 1619 New York Times piece, because you have, and this is what James Baldwin said, and I don't have the quote exactly, but when you have ignorance and power, it is dangerous when it comes to justice. And even as my colleagues, my Republican white male colleagues that I talk with, I say, we talk about injustices all the time because you don't realize how pervasive slavery is and the effects after our so-called freedom. The violence that took place, I went to Alabama in 2019, and I was able to participate in the Bloody Sunday March. And I also went to the exhibit, the equal rights exhibit. I can't remember the exact name. I went to that exhibit, and it was heart-wrenching because of all of the lynchings, deaths that took place that we can document that happened, and how people left the South and came to the North, and moved to places like Albany, to Chicago, to Syracuse, where they could get jobs and just be free to work and not be lynched. We all know what the North had going on. The racism was still there. But when we talk about it, it's so pervasive that in every time we do legislation, they think it's just, oh, you guys should get over it. How can you? You can't just get over anything that every day affects your life. And I'm just going to end with this. A good friend of mine said yesterday, a young brother said, I want to make sure that my driver's license is intact, you know, because I can get stopped by the police. He said it's inevitable. And I took that, and one of my Republican colleagues called me today, and I said, I want you to think about this. Have you at any point ever said it's inevitable that I will be stopped by police? And he said, no. I said, well, that's what young Black men, not young Black men, Black men say all the time. So you can't tell me that when we pass legislation in Albany, how it all ties in when we're saying about how important our history is, why we talk about the Irish coming here with the potato famine, but we don't talk about the violence that was committed in the streets of New York when it came to Black people. How can you not talk about that? How can you not teach our children about that? And that will explain a lot of why we are in the predicament, because white people as well as our people are not knowing their history.
One of the other questions is an extension of your comments, Sister Hyman. Brother Fuller talking about the race riots and the massacre. I always have to separate what I call a riot and what I call a massacre of the Red Summer of 1919 and all the riots that took place, and the Tulsa 21, Rosewood in Florida in 1923, and then the Elaine Massacre also. Can you speak to that historically, what these riots, why these riots took place, and the extension of these riots, not only in the summer of 1919, called the Red Summer, but how they've extended through that period of the 60s in the South as well?
Well, yeah, let's be clear. 1964 to 1968, every summer, the newspapers in all the urban areas of the United States would say, is this going to be our turn? I was in the riots, the rebellion, whatever you want to call it, in Newark, New Jersey in July of 1967. There's a House Un-American Activities Committee report that cites me and a whole bunch of other SNCC staff members who were a part of everything that led to that organizing. I think that what is important is to point out that if you think about that century, if you think about from the teens to the 60s, you had a commission that was put together by Lyndon Johnson and headed by Otto Kerner. The Kerner Commission literally looked at that period of long, hot summers. And what was the prophetic conclusion that they wrote in the very first sentence of the introduction? We are rapidly developing into two nations, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. That was in 1968. Where are we today?
Same.
Redlining and segregation still exist. New York is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Brother Jackson, you did not follow all of the people from Mississippi who took the Illinois Central to Chicago, because that's where all of the Mississippi Fully Loves from Yazoo City and Belzoni wound up. Y'all found your way to New York, but
We have family in Chicago too.
there you go, there you go. And I'm just sort of pointing out that everything that we have done has been reversed because the largest proportion of African Americans in the United States today, for the first time since the Great Migration, are now living below the Mason-Dixon line. How many of y'all in the audience now have people who said, I'm going to Atlanta?
Yes.
How many people have fled back to Charleston, which is where the Carolinas basically contributed to the Black population here in New York City? I mean, it's literally because we keep trying to find a place where we can establish communities, make those communities strong, and take a stance where we're able to organize ourselves to do for ourselves what every other immigrant group has done in the United States. So everything about those riots was a way in which we were trying to make it clear the segregation that has so deprived us of freedom is something that, if it's not defeated, is going to ultimately bring down every structure of a democratic republic like this. I'm very
Brother man, I need to cut you off because we have about 5 minutes left.
We do have someone who raised their hand who has a question, George, and we also have a Facebook question.
Okay, I want to use this Facebook question as our last 5 or 6 minutes, and it says, coming from Liam Mendazzi, how would you advise directors of predominantly white nonprofits to introduce the value of Juneteenth to the staff and upper management? I'll start with Sister Dukes, Brother Fullalove, and then Assemblywoman Hyman.
I think what you're doing starting this week in Queens is absolutely critical. And I see staff members that is on this call. I think the more, and you started this, Dr. Jackson Saku. I know of your work through Helen Marshall, who, God bless her soul, started with you guys. And I know the kind of work you've done in that community. I think that the continuation of it have to be done through our nonprofit, not political, but telling the truth, speaking truth to power. You know, as the Assemblywoman said, we have to make people uncomfortable sometimes to tell them the truth. And so I think the more we have, as Senator Comrie said, the more we have these kind of settings and this kind of education in our community, people will get it. And most certainly our nonprofit as a community organizer. I mean, look, for those people in Nassau County, there were shanty shacks when I started off as an organizer in Freeport, Roosevelt. It was awful. I made with the late Mrs. McCall, the ministers down there, we made them clean up for African Americans. So when you talk about Mississippi, we still have those places in New York. We gotta look at New York State and stop looking at Mississippi and Georgia. We gotta know here in Rochester. We gotta know in Syracuse. We got to know in Manhattan for gentrification. I sit on Community Board 10. We have more homeless shelters and more substance abuse. Why? They come from Queens to come to Harlem.
Thank you.
They don't want their neighbors to know.
We have
So
one
sure.
more question. We have one more question from George Dixon, and I don't see.
President of my NAACP chapter.
Good afternoon, Brother Jackson. I know you remember about Branch and Corona East Elmhurst, but your first question was, when do we first hear about Juneteenth? I first had the experience of Herabani in Africa in 1992, where they started their Juneteenth celebrations. I had to go back to the motherland in order to hear about Juneteenth. And I'm a child of South Carolina. You were talking about those rivers, but we came up 301 and up 13 up the coast to get to New York. And all of the things that you were saying, in particular, Assemblywoman Hyman and Fullilove, Dr. Fullilove, it was very interesting to know that in our schools, you're talking about what the Board of Education should do, but we should press hard as a people to change that curriculum. And it's not just for our children, but for all the children. If white children do not know what they're being taught, somebody has to get in there and teach them truth. And truth will always speak to power. And I believe that we have a responsibility, as it was said earlier, to take this holiday and sit down as a training day, as a day when no one goes out and has cocoa or barbecue, but sit down and find those pictures of the ancestors, find those older ancestors who know the history, know your history of your people. And I'm gonna say this as one last thing. My wife and I travel. We travel all over the world. We're a respected people in most places in the world. We've been 96 nations, 7 continents, but guess what? I'm afraid to travel in these United States because I'm a Black man. I will not get in my car and drive out to Oklahoma. I will not drive through Wisconsin. I will not drive upstate New York unless I have company. So it is a situation where we are endangered, an endangered species, and we are hunted. We are being hunted. And if you don't believe it, look outside your window. I'm done.
Thank you, Brother George. Brother Jamel, I also want to acknowledge the role that Elm Corps Youth and Adult Activities has played as part of this, as a partner organization, as a Black nonprofit in North Queens, partnering with Sister Hyman's staff and the other organizations. And thank everybody for participating in this panel. My esteemed panelists, Sister Dukes, Brother Fullilove, Assemblywoman Hyman, but also the people in the audience who are from around the country and around the city and state, that you thought this was worthwhile enough to sit down and join us today and open up this week of Juneteenth activities. And each evening we have a 6 p.m. panel that starts at Eastern Standard Time that you should connect with, dealing with different topics. I think tomorrow's is a health, mental health panel, and then Wednesday is a migrations panel. So if you are interested in activating your educational appetite and edutain yourself with these activities this week, with this Juneteenth 2021 in Queens, Assemblywoman Hyman, I'm going to let you close us out as the chair of our Juneteenth 21 committee. Leave it in your hands.
Thank you, Brother Sekou. I have to say thank you for saying yes, Brother Sekou, and Sister Saida, I think she was on earlier. Thank you for saying yes when I made the request to ask that you participate, because I wanted this to be a Queens-wide event. And yes, a lot of us are in Southeast Queens, but we have picked up from wherever we are in this world and made Queens the borough, the international borough. But let us not forget the Black people who came here from the South and were in Harlem or uptown, and they moved to Queens. They bought their homes in Queens. And I don't take for granted every day that how blessed I am to be in this position to serve. And I've always said, as long as I can, as long as I'm in this seat, it's it's on my heart that I have to make sure I leave this community better than I found it. And not just for the 29th district, but for all of our people in the state of New York. And I'm just blessed to serve, and I'm blessed to have a great staff. Tanisha Morrison, Sharice Parson, and I kind of adopted Safira. I don't know where she is right now, but I have to say that it takes a village to make this happen. I don't do this on my own. I have a great team that's with me, and thank you for saying yes. And I really hope people play this back. And hey, Sister Dukes, I think that teaching is what we should be doing next time when Juneteenth happens, is that we make sure that we are absent from the community, but to learn about ourselves. until such time as the New York State Education Department does what we needed to do. We need to teach our children and our adults. That's the other part too. But I'm so honored that all of you said yes. And we have a lot more work to do. And I hope you share this with your friends and family about the significance of Juneteenth moving forward in the state of New York.
And with that, on behalf of Honorable Hazel Dukes, Dr. Robert Fullerlove, Assemblywoman Alicia Hyman, and myself, Andrew Sekou Jackson, peace and blessings. Happy Juneteenth and peace and blessings. Thank you very much for joining us.